I'm here with my fabulous trusty, amazing producer, Kai Sorensen, and we are going to offer you like an incredible interview with Daniel J. Cox, who is a famed National Geographic cover story photographer, and involved with Polar Bears International, passionate about caring and putting his energy into conservation of both important species that are potentially disappearing and the ecosystems around them. So, it's big stuff. It's big stuff, but we don't even see it. Like, he just got back from Norway, from like the Arctic Circle area of Norway for a month, to bring us the depth of the kind of stories that are happening in our world today.
I mean, it was such a fun conversation to edit because I didn't have to edit much. Before we started recording, I think it was clear that, Jessica, you were deep in the rabbit hole, doing research on Daniel and his work. And, so many familiar concepts came up, like we can't save or we can't begin to conserve what we don't know, what we can't see, right? Yeah. Like, so the fact that he's in those places, taking photos of these areas that are going away, and bringing those back to us to enjoy, will create that sense of urgency that we have work to do in terms of steering us away from disaster when it comes to the climate. And I think just as a person, he's just so mellow, and his background was just clearly he's a professional photographer. The National Geographic photos are behind him. It's just so well kept, and I felt like I could just that kind of room I feel like is what my personality is: nice and clean and neat. And
okay, amazing. But I'm looking at your background. So
this is all my instruments.
I know. I mean, but it's being surrounded by your passions, like having, and he's super humble, right? Like, he was just in this deep conversation, so inspiring, so meaningful, but just like, calm and purposeful and deeply passionate about what he does and why he does it. And the most important part, I think, is that he brings the story. Like when you come to the places of these really important long-term media sources like National Geographic, they've been telling us stories, not just showing us facts for decades and decades. Right. I mean, I think we used to watch them on Sunday night before your time, the National Geographic show, which was all about the stories of nature and people. And the original Guardians, just as Ken Coe had mentioned. It was such a joyful conversation. And I was so excited that I got to give him some new facts and factoids and information, right? He did not know. A bit. Yeah, like water bear. And then we had this amazing conversation of comparing the episode that we dropped about hunkering down and tardigrades, which are also known as water bears, with polar bears. And it's really freezing out, right? Like, we have this like total cold Arctic thing going on, at least across the US, even in Florida. It's a little bit colder the next few days. And, these are species that live in extremes, and they seem drastically different, and they are similar in so many ways. So we have this great conversation about it, and about the whole idea of hunkering down and the different ways that you can do that. You can either just completely shut down, right?
That'd like putting your head in the sand, right?
Putting your head in the sand and like completely disconnecting with everything, right? And just waiting for it to go away, which is what the tardigrade does. And it's magical. And we're, as humans, doing all this science research to like figure out how it does that, and waits to come back in better times. And then the polar bears, who, like, they slow themselves down, they do what they need to do, they hunker down, and they come back with new babies and a new look on life, with a sense of what they can control and what they can influence, and take on life again after taking a rest. And I feel like, I don't know, I'm not sure if you have some advice for our listeners, given the turbulent political times that we're going through, and just so many cruel things it feels like are going on right now. I guess, what's the difference between hunkering down and putting your head in the sand in moments like these? Like, how can we apply some of those 3P concepts to what we're going through now? Such an important question. So I was really inspired by the story that Dan shared, which is, he can just choose to put his head in the sand and like disappear and go on these long missions to deeply connect with nature and just deeply disconnect with human. Although wherever you go, you can't avoid the human impact and facing reality about it, right? So he had chosen, he was going to the state capitol today, I think, to advocate
in Montana,
for
where he's from, right?
To advocate for the things he cares about. And it was uncomfortable. Like, it's uncomfortable to be part of something and to recognize that you have an influence and to participate. It's uncomfortable for most people who aren't like centered on advocacy. Sure. But the choice is, you can either stick your head in the sand and hope that, just like live on hope. Hope is not a plan. It's not a strategy. Somebody important said that, right? Like that hope. How long are you going to wait? Like, how long are you just going to just hide and bury yourself in the sand? So instead, hunker down, like calm your body, calm your mind, figure out what you have control over, what you have influence over, and what you have no control over. So, we've talked about this on and off. You have no control over most of the politics that are going on in the world today. But you have some influence in anything that you choose to participate in. Every bit of anyone's voice, no matter how small, does make a difference and can make a difference. Right. And if we bury our heads in the sand, we're not exerting, that possibility of influence. So just keep that in mind. And then, think about the 3 Ps. We talked about the 3 Ps in episode 1 about the tardigrades, and ways to just reconsider what stress we're taking on. And the 3 Ps are to consider what's happening in the world of pervasive, permanent, and personal. So is what you're dealing with pervasive? Is it really impacting every part of your life? Is every part of your life awful? Is everything that's going on awful? Is every politician awful? Is every environmental activity that's going on awful? The reality is no. So look for some good stuff, grab onto it, and put your energy into recognizing that there is some good, so that you have some sense of hope. And some influence. Personal, it is not, in general, about you. It's usually about stuff that's going on that you have no control over and other people. So hold back the judgment, make some intentional thinking and decisions, and recognize that you are not the center of the universe on everything that happens. So you don't need to blame yourself.
Yeah, that's been a large part of my journey, is the ability to recognize when something's personal. Yeah. And instead of reacting, what do I do with that energy, right? Yeah. So what's that 3rd P?
Yeah, react and response, by the way, in terms of like, you have the choice. You can either react, which is instinct and not usually well thought out and intentional, or you can respond in a more proactive, intentional way. Right. And the 3rd is personal, pervasive, permanent. It's not forever. Like, if we're just going to talk about politics and we're just going to talk about the environment, the reality is that there are some extinctions that are happening. There's so many extinctions that are happening. There's so much damage being done to our environment, for example, that is going to happen. Drill, 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 baby is not a good thing for our environment. Right. But it's not forever. There are ways that we can influence everything else in your life. Most things are not permanent, and those that are, when we lose somebody, when we lose the capacity to do something, when a job disappears, a relationship disappears, whatever it happens to be, there's a hope, there's the next chapter, there's always something next that has potential to be better, at least as good or better. So no, so well said, and such a good reminder, and a good way to. We're recording in the morning right now, and it's a good way to kick off the day with that kind of energy. So let's read a review and get to this interview. Sound good? Awesome. Yeah.
All right. Great. So this is from Carrie Gormley.
Yeah. Friend.
Oh, okay. It's a friend.
I give Carrie Gormley credit for getting me in the podcast business. She was a podcaster for years, and she gave me a lot of great advice. And she said, find a producer. She said, don't do this yourself. And I found Kai. So thank you. Thank you, Carrie. Yeah.
And Carrie knows the importance of a review and what that does for our show. So again, if you have the time, please take a minute to just jot down some thoughts. It helps get this podcast into more people's ears. But here's
and we'll shout you out. We'll read your review.
Like this. So Resilience Gone Wild is an amazing podcast that brings on super interesting guests who share fascinating information. The host, Jessica Morgenthau, asks smart questions that help her guests shine even brighter and share their positive messages. I love how Jessica shares her love for nature and people in such an empowering way. This is my new favorite podcast, and I can't wait to learn more with Jessica and guests.
Yeah,
emoji raised at the roof, emoji star.
You're the best. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, should we get to the interview?
Yay. Yes. All enjoyed it. Yay, welcome Dan Cox, Daniel J. Cox in full title of an incredibly successful and impactful nature photographer. So welcome to Resilience Gone Wild.
Thank you.
So thrilled you're here. Having just gotten, I think, back from one of your crazy or wild expeditions to the tundra.
We were in Norway for 4 weeks, and oh my goodness, it was very strange. Just, it was supposed to be lots and lots of snow, and we finally, our last week, we got some snow, but the first week we got there, we had snow, and then it warmed up so high that everything melted, and it rained for almost 2 weeks. Pouring, driving rain.
January in the Arctic. Have you ever experienced that before?
No, but you have to be careful a little bit because, Norway is it has the Gulf current that comes up through the north and actually makes that northern part of the Arctic warmer than we would expect. And, that's by way of the current that comes up from the south. I believe it's called the Humboldt current. And, it affects the weather, but certainly
it reminds me of a trip to Alaska when we were kayaking in Resurrection Bay, and I gather it never freezes, but you would think that all of Alaska freezes, and it's all about the currents. So we need to be very, very aware of the flow globally around our Earth that we don't pay attention to, right? Like there's this whole global movement of heat and energy and nature
I mean, we all, it's really easy to be in your own little world, especially if you don't get out and travel. And it's one of the things that I think is so important about travel is getting to see the other places around the planet and meet the people who live there, who have seen this stuff change and have experienced the changes that we're seeing here in the United States, in particular in Montana, where I live. Much warmer winters than normal. Although this winter we're having a pretty good solid winter, but it didn't start off though.
Yeah. Just to your point about meeting the people who have experienced life there for generations or millennium and have been the guardians. I did a podcast with a friend of mine who's a nature photographer, and he focuses on Africa and species in Africa of all different types. And we talked about the fact that there are guardians, like that the people who've been there, we walk in as travelers, but that those who need to care for the local ecosystem have been there forever. And we need to respect that and to talk to them and ask them for advice and learn from them.
Yeah. No, that's important. But and that's one of the great things about traveling is it's so important to see other people's perspective and experience some of the things that we don't experience if we just stay in our own little community and don't go anywhere.
Yeah. Although I have, one of the things that really kind of blew my mind, and I've really embraced it, is the concept, and I repeated this a number of times on the podcast because I was so taken by it. Tim Ferriss did an interview with Craig Foster, who is the octopus teacher, filmmaker, and he made a comment about how Tim made a comment about how we're on first name basis. Tim made a comment about how he wanted to eventually live in nature in large scale to raise his children and his family. And Craig Foster made a comment that has really gone deep in me, and it kind of relates to this. tardigrade versus polar bear, one of the smallest creatures to one of the largest creatures, that you really only need a bit of nature as long as you look closely and you pay attention, and you don't, being surrounded in large scale is magnificent. And you can see an ecosystem of that scale in action. But if you look at just a very small bit, there's so much going on there too.
There's so much going on. Yeah, it's an astonishing array of creatures and animals that one of the things that I am regularly reminded, even though we have lost so much here in the United States and North America since the settlers came across and basically exterminated the bison and lots of other animals, we still have a lot, but it is kind of sad. I did a shoot in Tanzania. I guess it was 10, 12 years ago. And the main reason I went was to catch the migration of the wildebeest in the southern part of Tanzania. And the reason for it was because I was hoping to see what I was told were 3 million animals. And I've always wondered what millions of animals would look like. What we had here in North America at one time, I hear the figures anywhere from 35 to 65 million bison. Now that's a pretty big stretch and difference, but even if it was 35 million bison, it's just staggering to think of the numbers that must have been, if you could only see that, let alone imagine it. And the thing that's so discouraging and kind of sad is that people don't, if something's gone and they've never experienced it, they don't really miss it. And so, it's one of the things that I try to remind myself of is, even though I feel like we have a lot of wildlife here in North America, I can only imagine what it was like when the first settlers came across, and they likened it to Africa. In fact, the plains of North America were likened to the Serengeti. I read about wolves and bison and elk and all the things that, most of those things have moved to the mountains because we've settled the plains.
Right. It's interesting. You remind me of, I've heard that polar bears are often mentioned as a key species that people will notice if they're gone. Like, we have this connection with polar bears that we don't have with so many, including bison, in this country.
That's true.
And they brought the bison back in Europe in a small scale as well. And, they're in very controlled environments. It's a different, it's not 60 million or 60 billion, whatever. But, to the fact that your, at least for now, your life's focus is heavily around the survival of the polar bears and their environments. It's a really important, powerful thing that it's a species that we will notice and that we do notice.
There is something different about polar bears. One is they're white, and there is something unique about white animals and white creatures that people are drawn to. Brown bears are every bit as cute, and black bears are incredibly cute, but they just don't get the same attention. And bears get a lot of attention in many ways because I think people have a tendency. This is kind of hard to imagine, but I was in a camp many, many years ago. Oh my God, it's probably 30 years ago, a black bear camp where they had killed a couple of black bears and they had skinned them and they're hanging from a pole. Now, this is hard to describe. It was back when I was young, and I had some friends in my life that love to hunt, and I'm not against hunting if you're doing it for meat and putting food on the table. But I don't understand why anybody shoots a bear. But anyway, that's different for me today. But they look so human as far as their body makeup and their muscles, and And there's something about bears that, and then on top of that, they're very, very smart. So, you know,
another species that we underestimate the intelligence of. And as I learn, and you're ahead of me on this, you've learned, I'm sure, about so many species that of the intelligence and the sentience of so many species in your work, which I do want to ask you to describe yourself. That, you know, the more we spend time with any one species, the more we understand how smart they are. And that they're doing things not just by instinct, which we write off as unintelligent, right, as humans, but that there's so many deeper layers to it. So yeah, keep going with that.
Yeah, no, it's true. I've said it for so long that we, you know, just because they can't speak to us as far as a language that we understand, we think that they're, you know,
that we understand.
Yeah,
perfect
that we understand.
Point, right?
Yeah, and exactly. I mean, we're holding them to a level that just because we don't understand it doesn't mean it's not there. And you know, there's been so much good information in the last, you know, 20, 30 years on the different sounds that whales make and other animals make that they have actually been able to decipher as languages. And who knows what they're saying about us.
Right? It's such a good point. And when I was on a safari recently in Botswana, and speaking of being with those who have been there forever and are the guardians, the guide I was with was, you know, the guides we were with were so knowledgeable about the voice and the language of every animal that was around them, you know, and each and every different species of bird. Specifically, they could, you know, that's part of the training and part of the requirement.
Right.
To be able to speak the language of every other species. And we don't, like, we need to go to places like that. We need to connect with people like that who are speaking the language or understanding the language. And many of them have learned to sort of participate, you know, and practice being in their language. But it is a life-changing experience to be in conversation with another species and to set that aside and say, we are not better. They're just speaking a different language than we understand.
Language. I know it. And the animals have so much more going on than we give them credit for. And therefore, I think they can also, you know, when we have, you know, being at the top of the food chain and having a brain that allows us to create weapons and things that can harm them, and they have a difficult time getting away from, you start to really feel that there might be something else going on there that is really difficult to try and justify how we handle things because they know what's going on.
They certainly do. Someone told a recent, I had done an interview with a man it dropped a few weeks ago, a man from the Netherlands who had spent a year in Botswana, actually, as a social media, like trying to create their social media, some of the camps so that they could communicate, you know, what was going on. And he spoke of the experience of having trusted the guides who had been there forever and knew the language of the animals and what they were thinking, and the interaction with lions and wild dogs who knew the capacity of humans to threaten them. Like we became part, because of our capacity to use weapons, to therefore be at the top of the food chain, right? They have figured out, I think sadly, you know, we've broken into their entire millions of years of their systems, and they know that we're the ones to be afraid of.
Right. Yeah.
And that's really, honestly, the word that's coming to mind is freakish. Like, it's really disturbing to have broken the system. And I'm happy that the animals, a lot of them have figured out who to be afraid of, you know, like, because they need to make sure that they know who to be afraid of. And that would be us.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, you can see it when you're in the wild. When I had a situation in Kenya many years ago where we were watching a female lion under a bush, and she had laid down for the day. And there was a Maasai warrior and they call them Maasai warriors. They're, typically not really fighting anymore, at least not that I'm aware of, but they dress traditionally. The Maasai run their cattle in the Masai Mara Game Reserve, and we watched him walking up the river, and he was at least a half a mile away, and he had a bell of some sort, and so it was making some noise, and she had not seen him originally, and we'd seen this native person first, and all of a sudden it just registered that he was coming, and she saw him and heard him. And here we were in this vehicle sitting watching her, knowing that we were there, no indication whatsoever that there was any concern from us. But this guy coming up the river, she saw him and took off running like she had been shot at, but she recognized. And then so part of what I've heard, I've never been able to prove this, is that still in the Maasai community, young men are encouraged to go out and kill lions. And
makes sense, right? The whole thing makes sense.
Well, it does when you hear that, and then all of a sudden this lion from a half a mile away sees this guy walking in this red robe, and with a bell coming along, takes off like she was literally shot in the butt with a BB gun or something. And she ran for half a mile until she went over the hill and we couldn't see her anymore. But she was literally petrified of that person coming up the riverbank. And what
I always think of in cases like that, which I think that, we can shift a drop to the conversation about survival in the Arctic and hunkering down and all that comes with all that, is the same as the reaction I have to sport fishermen. And I know sport fishermen because I live in Florida at the beach more than I know hunters, but I'm pretty sure it's the same situation that, well, maybe, but the fishing for sport where you wrestle with marine life and you have them fight you and use up staggering amounts of energy to then release them and assume that that's okay. I'm an energy oriented person. I teach it and I study it in terms of energy and how we behave to others based on our energy, negative, positive, how much capacity we have. And to me, that lion was not planning on having the resources, the energy resources to be able to run at that speed, to get away in fear. That wasn't part of the plan, like the system. So now that lion has to go find more food, right? Yeah. What comes to mind around all that?
Well, I hesitate. One of the things I grew up as a hunter, and in fact, the part of the reason I do what I do today is because I grew up in the outdoors with a family that spent time hunting and fishing. And but my father, he never hunted for trophies. He hunted literally to put food on the table. Yeah. Our Thanksgivings were Canada geese and pheasant, as opposed to domesticated turkeys and that sort of thing. And I miss that because I no longer hunt. I just can't bring myself to kill things any longer. But yes, you are right. Those are things that it's a good example of an animal not being able to basically control the situations that they get themselves into, and we as humans are a big part of that. But I hesitate to, I know a lot of sportsmen that fish and really, really connect with the outdoors and conservation. And
absolutely.
And so I do, I wonder times, especially in today's world where young people are not being shown or don't show any interest in these same types of things, whether it's fishing or hunting or getting a camera, walking into the woods, hiking, doing whatever, and where these, how these places are going to continue to be appreciated. And if we don't have some things that humans can do, and humans, in a perfect world, we'd all just kind of sit around and look at the stuff and go, okay, well, but I'm just glad it's here. But humans have this need to have to try and do something. And I think a lot of the sports fishermen, they started out fishing because they were putting food on the table in a lot of situations. And they've come to really appreciate some of the things that they're after.
Yeah.
But I do agree with you. I mean, there is an immense amount of energy that a fish gets when a fish gets hauled in like that. Yeah. But I don't know. It seems that when humans are basically pull back from messing with these animals, they really prosper. There was a recent article I read about an area in the North Pacific where they completely shut down fishing, completely shut down all interaction of anybody in the area, and the amount of fish that started to come back was just like nothing they'd ever seen. So I don't know. I tell people this a lot. In a perfect world, we humans are not here. I believe that.
And we probably won't be here. The world will survive way longer than us.
I believe that. And my hope is that we just don't annihilate everything that's natural before we end up being taken out ourselves. And we are, 99% of all species on the planet have gone extinct. And, for anybody that thinks that we're not in the crosshairs of that same end, they're not being realistic. It probably will happen, and I'm just hopeful that the animals there will be a lot of really cool animals left going. Yeah, I'm so glad those guys are gone.
I know, right? Absolutely. So on that note,
we haven't talked much about polar bears. I'm sorry.
And we haven't even introduced how awesome you are, and I don't want to miss that.
I don't.
First of all, okay, you can be humble if you want, and there's these beautiful National Geographic covers behind you, and I'm staring at this gorgeous owl staring back at me. So please just introduce yourself and share what you're contributing to our world, because you can put it that way. It's not about you, it's what you're contributing and your sense of purpose.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think that for me, that's really important. It's not about me. So many places I go anymore, I see people going to those places and then having to get in front of the camera to show people themselves in this magnificent area. And my feeling is, get out of the way. That's not what's important. It's what's behind you that is important. I get so frustrated with that. And believe me, I was just in Norway where, the selfie crowd is just so tough to handle because it's not about you. It's about this incredibly beautiful backdrop that we have and why it's so special. So I started as a young photographer. I mean, my father, I mentioned earlier, my father and I spent a lot of time as a young boy hunting and fishing started out in the state of Washington, where I was born and raised until I was about 8. We moved to northern Minnesota at about 9 years old, and I grew up on a little tiny farm, hobby farm, and wanted to get back west as I grew up. I loved the mountains, and so I ended up in Montana, where I'm at now, and I've been here since 1987. But Dad loved photography, but raising 5 kids, he didn't have a lot of money to, back in those days. My goodness, the amount of cost that we incurred taking pictures with film and process, and then having to process it.
So, it was so funny. I just have to say, it was so funny. I was watching an interview that you had done, and you asked the other person if they knew what film was. And I really feel like there are things that, like, my kids know what a rotary phone is because I've shown them, and hopefully they know what film is, but it's like a completely different world. Every picture we took mattered because you had to pay for it to be developed, and you only had so much. Yeah. Like, you brought the big bag of film with you, and you hoped it didn't get ruined in the X-ray machines, right?
Yeah, you're right. You're dead on. You've had some photography in your blood. I can hear it. Yes, absolutely. That was a big deal back in the 80s and 90s when I was, up until about 2004 when I switched over to digital. But yeah, that was a big deal. but learning, from my father, the important thing, I didn't learn my photography from my father, although he did inspire me with a camera that he had, and I got to use when I was around the house. I wanted to start taking pictures for my school newspaper, and I played sports, and my buddies wanted pictures of him in the sports, and and when I asked him if I could take it to school, he said, "No, you can't take it to school. If you want to take it to school, you got to buy your own." All right. Well, my sister and I had a 1968 GTO. It's when I look back on it and hear about it, and it wasn't running right, and I wasn't a car guy. We just happened to buy this thing together. Anyway, long story short, we sold it. I took my $500 and bought a camera, and then that kind of started me on my way into the world of photography. But the fact that I had spent so much time in nature, hunting and fishing with my father, kind of, guided me to this interest in taking pictures of animals.
What was it that we were thinking in the moment of wanting to take the picture? Because you just said, which is a big issue today, people are taking selfies so that they can post it and they can be cool. It's not about what's in the background. It's about the fact that they were there in the background. So actually, I've never asked this. Like, what is it that was the draw to wanting to take the picture?
I think that's a good question. I think it's the challenge originally for me, as a young, 16-year-old photographer. I think of the first time I went out with a telephoto lens and a camera and tried to get pictures of white-tailed deer on this farm that we lived on in northern Minnesota. And I believe, it had to do with a challenge. The other thing is I love animals. So it was a challenge to like get closer to them and be closer to their lives. I loved, we had dogs growing up, we had horses, and animals were really special. I mean, they just interested me. And so this idea of sitting down in the field and knowing that they came out late in the afternoon, early evening, and maybe if I just was quiet enough and kind of sat tight enough that they wouldn't be too fearful and maybe give me a chance to take their picture. And that, so, so there's a couple of things going on there. One is the challenge. And that's what, photography, I mean, a lot of people.
And by the way, that's a big part of purpose, right? Like I teach about purpose, and in purpose, you have to have some and flow. There has to be some challenge. If it's too easy or too hard, it's not you need the sweet spot that makes you feel like you've accomplished something, because that's what a human need is.
And that goes back to kind of what I was saying earlier, is that humans, I mean, in a perfect world, we'd all just stand around and appreciate the stuff. But we as humans go, oh God, maybe I could catch one of these fish, or maybe I could do, at least with photography, if you're not bothering the animals, and that's such an important part of wildlife and nature photography, is respecting the animals, respecting their distance that they need to be from you, typically, understanding that getting the picture is not the be all end all. That's one of my biggest pet peeves is, whatever it takes to get the picture, not in wildlife and nature photography. I mean, if you want to do that in the war zone, all right, maybe you'll win a Pulitzer. I'll never win a Pulitzer with a white-tailed deer picture, but
you might with a polar bear.
Huh?
You might with a polar bear.
I don't know.
Because there's a story like that. I think the point to me, what I'm hearing is, it's about the story that is captured. And the urgency versus honoring nature and not disturbing it, the urgency of sharing the story. And I feel like, it's a complex combination of the challenge plus the respect plus honoring them by telling their story to others who aren't there.
That's the biggest thing for me, is that animals, we talked again, this segues back into what we talked about earlier, is that they can't speak. And
well, they can, but we can't hear them.
Yeah, we don't understand it. And maybe if they could whisper in our ear, a cute little polar bear could, come up and not, attack us when we got cuddled in our arms. If we could whisper in our ears what is going on in their life and how we might be able to, it might have an effect on us, but they can't. So they go on, doing their thing almost like, mutes. and it's we don't relate to it. So it's telling that story that has become important to me. And again, today in our world today, where a lot of people have become photographers just because they have a phone in their hand now. It's disappointing for the wrong reasons, it seems, for many, not everybody. But when I see it constantly that it's about them in the environment as opposed to whatever the environment is, and that's what I cherish. And man, there's nothing, I appreciate more than going to these special places and not wanting to be a part of it, right, as the main subject, but be a part of it to just show why it's so special.
To be in it, not to be, to be in it. So I'd love to hear the rest of your story. So you were taking pictures. The goal was you started by capturing the beauty and the brilliance of nature that existed on your farm, the white-tailed deer. And so go forth with that story, because it's important. Your story is important.
Well, it was a beginning challenge for me in my photography, where I started to understand why it was so difficult to get good pictures of these animals. And I mean, whitetails are pretty common, but where I was living at the time, they were still, and they still are today, hunted extensively. And so they're wary. The places that you can spend time getting closer to them are state parks, national parks, that kind of thing, where they're not hunted. But early on in my career, it became really evident that it wasn't easy to get pictures of these guys. And so the challenge and then the desire to tell that story just kept on growing with importance, and the desire to go do this became a driving force. And then I came to realize that, the white-tailed deer is not an animal that is endangered or has, it is doing really well across our country in North America. A lot of it because they have adapted to being able to coexist with humans in rural areas, and so they're not a species that's at risk. But it started to dawn on me that there are other animals that are every bit as difficult to capture pictures of, that could or are at risk, could be or are at risk. That's where the story comes in, of wanting to share that with people, that, my God, these things are really amazing. Can you imagine what if they weren't here? I mean, that's what happened to the bison are still here, but the numbers of them, that's what happened to the numbers that we used to have here in North American, on the North American plains. So I can't imagine. I mentioned earlier that if you've never experienced it, if you've never experienced a polar bear, being close to a polar bear, and when I say close, respectable distances that I work, or from within, vehicles or things that protect you so that the bear doesn't get in trouble. And that's such an important part of the whole thing, because you're working with animals that you want to elevate to a level of interest for people, that they get excited, and that it's important that you not become part of the story by all of a sudden getting involved with them in a negative way. And I do everything I can, and I don't have any good dangerous bear stories. It's amazing how many.
That's good.
I know it. I say that. I can't tell you how often I'm interviewed, and they say, "Well, have you got any really good, close encounters?" And I go, I really don't, and because I work really hard to stay out of that situation. Because if I don't, and a bear gets a hold of me or does something negative to me, and I'm lucky enough to live, the bear will be probably destroyed. So. Yeah. I'm kind of boring from that perspective. People want to hear about close calls, and
to me, that I honor that, to say the least. So
I appreciate it.
We're in alignment on that. Yeah. But you make an important point, which is not where we're going to specifically go with this, but it is a huge issue in our human world today that with so much more interaction with nature, with wild animals, because we've taken so much of their land and their habitat and taken it and changed it.
Mm-hmm.
Agricultural land, development, all of it, changed the water systems, changed everything, that the answer is always, it seems to be, I don't know, always, I hate to use the word always or never, but it is more often than not, the animal species loses. The animal loses in any interaction, no matter whose fault it was.
No, that's right. That is virtually almost always true. I've seen,
including in a zoo, when somebody goes into a zoo,
and jumps
enclosure.
in a cage, or I know we've heard those stories. Yeah,
too many times. Yeah.
Yeah. The animal pays the price. Yeah. Because I've got some thoughts on that, but
yeah. So like in terms of the bottom line of this part of the story is whoever's listening, like just keep this in mind when you're interacting with animals. Like you don't need to be in the story. The story is really good by itself without you, right? Like a picture of a polar bear is actually more exciting without you in it. And that you are risking their survival by getting too close and interacting, because they will be the ones who pay the price, as you said. So, always keep that in mind.
Yeah. Yeah. The animals, you're right. They virtually always lose if something happens where we, as stupid humans, do something that they correct us on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's
okay. So keep going. Sorry.
That's how I got into wildlife photography. And then I started thinking, really wanting to be part of the answer in getting people interested in making sure that we always have these things around and basically save them, or encourage conservation and understanding how we can live with these animals and still have them as part of our lives in the many areas that we have in the United States. And so that was the inspiration to start working with, back in the days when I was really working hard to make a living at this. I was working with, National Wildlife Federation, Audubon, the Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, all the big conservation groups, and helping them, offering pictures of these animals to help tell the story as to why it was important that their missions of saving habitat, saving specific animals themselves, and most of it comes down to habitat, to be honest. I don't know, a lot of people don't really think of that, but if the habitat is there, the animals almost always will repopulate and come back.
That's like the salmon runs. Like I think you were talking about it before. I'm not sure if that was the fish you were talking about, but when the salmon run rivers were reopened recently and people left the space alone, the repopulation was just unbelievably fast, right? Like,
Yep. They're already seeing, I think you're referring to some dams in particular in California that were taken out, and the salmon are back able to start, spawning up those rivers again.
Yeah.
And so it's all about habitat. And, part of the problem is that we humans like that habitat ourselves. So we just have to figure out ways to share it. So that's the way I look at it.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of habitat, I dug a little bit, like Polar Bear International, which you're very involved with, protects not just the polar bear, but to that point, like these nature organizations are not focused only on the species, the animal species, but on fauna, flora, fungi, phenomena. Like it's my fourth sounds that I like, and that you're focused on the sea ice survival. That is an absolute requirement for the polar bears to survive. Like they don't live separately as two things to work on. Right. We'll go with that. Yeah.
Well, the reason for it is polar bears it's absolutely essential. They earn their living on the sea ice because that's where the seals are. The seals give birth on the sea ice. They're big. They're big animals. A polar bear is a massive animal. Big males can have gotten recorded weights of up to 1,700 pounds, and 10 to 12 feet high if they were standing up. And so they require a lot of food. And in fact, this is one of the things that people hear about is, well, can't the polar bears just? I mean, they originally evolved from grizzly bears, which is kind of a whole nother story. So at one time they roamed the land and fed on the land. Couldn't they do it again? Well, no. I mean that it took them so long to evolve into a marine mammal, and that's what they are considered. Yeah. They're a total marine mammal. That it takes a big prey item, which might be their two favorites are the ring seal and the bearded seal. The bearded seal is big as 620 pounds. The ring seal quite a bit smaller at 120 pounds. But that's a lot of meat and a lot of fat. Ring seal has got a lot of fat on him, and that's typically what the polar bear is most interested in. If they're really hungry and have been without food for a long time, they will eat all the meat and the entire animal. But for the most part, I've seen polar bears where they just literally strip the fat and just eat the fat on the animal because it's
there's a plan, right? Like they know that they can only eat for a certain number of months, and then they have to have enough to reproduce, to hibernate, to do all that stuff for many months. So like they're pretty smart. They know exactly what they're looking for, right?
Yeah, that's right. And there has been I've talked to some biologists that say, the digesting actual meat takes more calories than just digesting and consuming the blubber. Right. So that's what they go for, and they need that. And the seals are very, very fat, and they're great food sources for these guys, and they can only catch them on the ice. Now, there's probably...
Well, I read it's because seals are faster than they are.
Seals are faster in the water. Yeah. Yes, the seals are faster. Although I photographed, and I don't know how he caught it. It looked like it was a bearded seal that had come probably up on land, and he found it, and snuck up on it and killed it because there was no ice at the time, and he was eating it on land. So they can capture animals on land, but in general, the seals will, stay out on the ice if they have ice, or stay on little islands and places where it's not as dangerous as normal the normal land that they might go to. Which is another thing about the ice, is without that ice, again, it affects the seals and walrus and all the animals that actually live on the ice when it's there. And that's one of the things that we just don't hear much about, is there's not as many people studying seals as there are polar bears. And a big part of the reason is that seals are really tough to keep track of. They dip under the water and they're gone. And they're very, very hard to keep track of and find out, how they're doing. But it makes sense that, if the seals don't have ice, that's another big part that's going to slip, is going to create big problems. Because
and to the end about the ice, like just to sort of respect the larger system of sea ice. And I just did a little digging about this, so I'm sure you know a lot more. Sea ice is not only there for the polar bears to sit on so that they can. It's so funny. Penguins just showed up on my screen. It's very odd, which I realize aren't up there in the Arctic. Yeah. So, algae you've got baleen whales, I assume, that are eating a completely different type of food. And it's all part of the system. Like sea ice is not only for the largest of the animals,
Right.
other purposes to it, right?
Yeah, there is. A friend of mine who's a biologist, Jeff York, described it one time as an upside down triangle. It looks, when you look at the sea ice, if you're ever fortunate enough to get up, let's say to the Beaufort Sea in Alaska, where I've done a lot of work, or any of the sea ice in the Arctic, it looks barren. It's many places it's very flat. If it's not flat, it's got jumbled ridges and you don't see, if you're lucky, you might see a seal, you might see a polar bear, but we flew in helicopters when I was working with Dr. Stephen Anstrup on his research, on his polar bear research, that was used for designating polar bears as a threatened species. First species ever added to the threatened species list, based on what they predict was going to happen. But Dr. Anstrup and I spent about 5 years documenting his work in the Beaufort Sea. And I remember, in a helicopter flying for miles and being able to see for tens of miles, not seeing anything. So it looks very barren and very lifeless out there until you run across the tracks of a polar bear. But if you're standing there, you're looking at the ice and you look at it and think, my goodness, how barren this is. Underneath that ice are the cod that feed on the plankton and the small animals that you described in your story on the
tardigrades.
Yes.
The tardigrades, yeah.
Yes, and these little guys are called amphipods. Not as small as the ones you are looking at, but very strange looking little critters like
I gotta look them up, yeah.
The sea angel and some actual really interesting critters. But it's all, so it all comes, it's like a pyramid from the top and the pyramid going down, where it starts with the smaller critters and then the seal, the fish eat the smaller critters, the seal eat the fish, the seal gets up on the ice and the polar bear eats the seal. So it's just like this upside down triangle. And
it's the classic metaphor, right? Iceberg is an incredibly well-known metaphor that we need to really embrace for the depth of the nature of it, in that, what is it, like 90% of an iceberg is invisible, is underwater, right? So all we're seeing is the top, and if we pay attention to what the invisible part is, it's most of the story. Yeah. It's most of the system, which is, can connect to the tardigrade. Like, we have no idea, because they're microscopic, that the tardigrades are part of every system on Earth, every ecosystem on Earth and in space and everywhere else. And just because we don't pay attention which sometimes things are big and we don't pay attention to them. But if we don't pay attention to things we literally can't see because they're invisible to the naked eye, we're missing a huge part of the story.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's what makes it interesting, to be honest. There's just, we as humans have not, we still have so many things to explore and keep track of and appreciate.
Yeah, for sure. So to the point of the past episode that sort of prefaces this one, which I had a lot of fun and so appreciated your joining for this second part of the conversation, because, polar bears, tardigrades are also called water bears. And it's such a funny connection that, you would think there's nothing in common between this microscopic, funky animal that has been around for over 500, at least as far as they've even proven so far, over 500 million years, has survived every extinction that has happened that we know of so far, and live everywhere on Earth, to polar bears, which are this adorable, and they actually are both adorable. Who knew, right? Like, the microscopic version, he actually is called a water bear because they're adorable and they look like bears.
Well, it's interesting because when you sent me the information on your last episode, I didn't know about a tardigrade. I looked it up and I had heard of the name that they of this little microscopic animals. Mm-hmm. I didn't know they're called tardigrades, but the little something. What is it again? It's something
water bear.
And if you take a look and get on the web and take a look at what they look like, They do have some sort of little
Yeah,
similarity.
they even have what looks like fur. They have like hairs. Like there's a better word for it than hairs. But like, they have a hair system going like polar bears too.
Yeah. Well, oh my goodness. The more I learn about nature, the more I realize how similar all living species are, from the very minute to the very biggest. And it doesn't surprise me that there's a
it's pretty incredible.
Similarity.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg, the similarity in the way they look on a microscopic versus, we've got one of the smallest animals to one of the largest animals. Funny enough, as a complete aside, the leatherback turtle is runs about the same size as the larger polar bears, which is so that's kind of wild to think that these two different creatures and they're both are in the sea, these enormous and microscopic sea creatures that we don't see. They're invisible to most of us because we don't live in the ocean, right? It's just such an important missing piece that we need to pay more attention to. But the comparison, I was doing a comparison between, what are the similarities and what are the differences between water bears and polar bears? And I thought it'd be fun to sort of throw this back and forth. If you've got the differences, of course, there's the size, there's the reproduction process, and the community-oriented. A tardigrade is a very solitary, microscopic creature. It lives with others, but not in connection in community. It can actually both sexually and asexually reproduce. And then you've got the polar bear, mammal that raises its young and the young is dependent on it. Very different experience in what it needs to survive. But there's other similarities, but then you've got other differences. Then you've got the similarity of the hunkering down, the living in extreme environments, which many tardigrades do in every extreme environment you can possibly imagine, more than any other creature can survive in. Radiation, all kinds of the deepest, coldest, and hottest places anywhere. And then you've got these two creatures that are so different that know that they have to slow their bodies down and hibernate to get through extreme times. Yeah. The polar bear hibernates, so it slows down. The tardigrade actually shuts down. It actually changes its molecular structure and can live 30 years, whereas it usually lives a few months to a couple of years, but it can survive decades in this frozen state. Wow. But the polar bear is pretty impressive that it hibernates and survives it at a much slower pace. So go with that. What did you find was interesting about the connection, the similarities, the differences,
Well, it's amazing. I mean, when you think about, again, I guess the biggest thing that's impressive to me is that a polar bear, even though they can't survive for, let's say, 30 years without doing their normal everyday life stuff like one of these little critters do. I was reading the information where the blood or their blood turns into some sort of some kind of material that basically is like an antifreeze.
It's amazing, right?
Yeah, I mean,
and we're learning from it. Like humans are trying to learn from so many species. I mean, biomimicry is such an enormous thing that we're not talking about. We don't realize how much of our existence and progress is based on learning from nature. Right. And now we're trying to learn from tardigrades about,
and bears do have a similar mechanism in their body that when they go into hibernation or into the den, and polar bears are a little different than the brown bears and the black bears, where they don't actually go into hibernation, but they do slow down. And I know the other bears have the ability to not defecate in their dens all winter long. They recycle their urine. They do all kinds of things that we ask ourselves, my goodness, how do they do this? Yeah. And so there's so many things that we can learn from these animals. And even though the tardigrades are doing something even more miraculous on a smaller level, polar bears are, when you think about where they live and how they have to bring up these baby bears in a den site that outside the den site can be as cold as 50 to 75 below zero, and that's not wind chill. I'm talking about ambient temperatures. Those are pretty miraculous conditions that polar bears have to pull themselves through, and so I've spent a fair amount of time in the denning areas, specific a denning area in the Manitoba province of Manitoba in Canada, and I'm always impressed with the fact that we as a photographer have to get out into these conditions.
I'm impressed.
I'm not saying I'm impressed with myself, but I'm saying to be able to function when the bears are living out there. And it's one of the things that it makes me love what I do is part of what is so important and impressive is seeing the conditions these animals live in, and then hearing about some of my brethren complaining about some kind of a difficult situation that they might be in. I had a situation a number of years ago where I was photographing a mother polar bear, and she had one cub that looked like it wasn't feeling well or seemed to be not doing as well as its sibling. She had two cubs, and it was very cold, 20, 30 below zero, I remember. And the scientists and people who study polar bears talk about how they're made for these conditions, and that they've got this, their fur is hollow, it helps keep them warm. They have lots of fat, all these things that they talk about as to why they're built to handle these conditions. And I saw this little cub, and it was a cub of the year, meaning he was, had been born that year sometime around January, 1st of January. And so he was in his 7-8 month time in life. And his sibling had climbed up on top of his mom and was cuddled up there on top. And the one on the bottom was on the ground and cuddled up next to her. And he had 1 foot down, and he would sit there, and that's what he would have, that 1 foot down for maybe 5 minutes, and then another 5 minutes go by, and he would pull that foot up and he'd put the second foot down. And so it was just a really good example of, he's got to be cold. I mean, his feet have got to be cold, or he wouldn't be picking one up, tucking it in for a while, and then then the other one would get cold, so he'd put that one, tuck it up, put it in his chest, and the other one. And it was just an example of even though they're built for this stuff, they still feel it. Another example.
But they have tools. That's resilience, right? Resilience isn't that it's easy. Resilience is that it's hard. Life is hard, and we need to have tools. And one of the tools that this polar bear cub has, is it knows that if it picks its 1 foot up, it'll warm up a little bit, and it'll put the other one down. And these are all resilience tools that we learn over time. I don't know if if that cub was born with the instinct to do that, or it had figured it out. It picked it up and it was like, oh, this is a little bit warmer. I can still balance.
My guess is they figure it out. I really believe that they can feel it. Another example was Polar Bears International, some work I was doing with them and the San Diego Zoo. And the San Diego Zoo had put in a new exhibit. And by the way, PBI, part of what they work to do with zoos and aquariums is to mandate and help them understand why the exhibits need to be up to a certain level so that these animals can be comfortable. And the San Diego Zoo has an amazing polar bear exhibit. And when they put that thing together, which cost tens of millions of dollars, they filled it up with cold water. The temperature, this is the story I heard, the temperature was similar to what the bears would have in the Arctic in the summertime. And it was something like 38 degrees or something like that. And the bears would not get into it. And so they finally started thinking, well, maybe we better warm the water up. So they warmed the water up and finally got it up to, like, if I remember right, like 55, 56 degrees. And the bears started using it. But the point is that, they will use that water in the Arctic if they've got to go hunting.
Right.
But
they don't like it.
But they don't love it. I mean, it's like, who wants
and they're getting fed. They don't have to be uncomfortable, right?
Yes,
to get their food.
Right.
That's so interesting.
But they do feel it. They do feel it. I mean, they're built for it. And they got fat and they're built for the cold temperatures, but they didn't want to get that 38 degree temperature water.
Oh, that's such a good, and it's such a great story of we have to pay more attention to what's going on and not make these assumptions that life is so simple for other species. Like they're as complex physically, emotionally, intellectually, like all of the layers that we're underestimating, and to assume that there isn't a complexity to the system and that they're doing things that are all easy is the biggest mistake, right? Like they're surviving by doing hard things, which gets to the human resilience issue. Like we need to do hard things to survive too.
That's exactly true. And it's part of our current situation in our country where we have lots of people. And I mean, I've had discussions with people who talk about being angry and being, all these difficult things that we have going on in their mind. And I say, at least to myself, depending on who I'm talking to, I mean, part of this is my opinion, obviously, part of what we've experienced is that we've had no serious health scares since the 1940s, 1930s. Plague has been eradicated. Polio got eradicated. All these things got eradicated. So we have this several generations of people who have no concept of what people all around you may be getting polio, and maybe you. I mean, things like that were
and
really
poverty to the level that there was before, and violence. Like there's just different levels that.
Well, not only that, World War II. These are all things we've lived through this time since the 1940s that were really, really easy. And this is what I mean when I see a polar bear that is picking its feet up because it's 40 below zero and it's trying to keep its feet warm. And I'm thinking, we've had such an easy go since the 1940s, when the end of World War II. We don't even know what really difficult times are. That's my opinion.
No, I agree with you. And in terms of like even the military, like we don't send, as Americans, we don't have the same expectations for putting our youth through tough stuff.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? Like the military is just one example of that. Like, but there's so much, coddling of the American mind, all of the around that resonance that is leaving younger generations really fragile.
Yes, I agree.
And that baby polar bear was not as fragile because it had adapted and figured something out.
Yes, and it makes me how this relates to my life as a wildlife photographer is that it makes me so much appreciate what I have, how easy my life is. I worked hard to get to where I'm at. I've been self-employed since I was 16 years old.
You sold your car to get your camera because you needed to have skin in the game. Dad said, I'm not giving it to you. You want it, you got to earn it.
You got it. Right? You want to take it to school, you got to buy your own.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, exactly. And that's what I love about nature photography, is that it gives you the opportunity to see how other creatures really do go through difficult times, and they don't have anybody pulling the punches for them. I mean, and so it makes me grateful, to be honest.
I think that's just so beautiful. There's such a lesson that I keep repeating, that I was, this question of how much time do you need to spend in nature to connect and change your mindset around feeling that you're part of nature versus you're watching nature, and that you're not dependent on it and it's not dependent on you. Is it 5 minutes? Is it 20 minutes? You had to watch that baby cub long enough to see it make that move, right? Mm-hmm. Like you watch it for 5 minutes and you're not going to get the same amount of interaction. You watch it for 20 minutes, you're going to get more because you're going to stop just seeing it as, oh, how cool is that, to, wow, look at the behavior. Like, what's the change that's happening? And then you go deeper and you just stay in flow, as opposed to the inability for us to focus these days and get into flow without needing a distraction. Like the challenge, I think, there's a big challenge to our human ability to stay in it.
Yeah, I agree.
And that is really damaging our resilience. So like, the message of hunker down when things are hard. I wrote that, and I started with that with like during election season. It was like people were just freaking out. Like, what do I do? It's like, okay, don't freak out. Like, just slow down. And what you have, it's the locus of control issue, right? Like, if you don't have control, make sure you vote, do something else, but like just calm down and don't burn all the extra energy worrying about things that you have no control over.
Well, I heard you mention that in, I don't know if I read it, or I think I read it in one of the piece that you sent me. And I thought that was really, it's what my wife and I have discussed for quite, for the last several years, is there's things that we, and she's better at it than I am. There's things that you just cannot control. So don't let it eat you so badly.
Right. But that doesn't mean you don't have permission to do, that you have permission to do nothing. Well, that's the key, right?
There's hitting that happy medium. I don't watch the news as much as I used to.
None of us do, right?
But I'm going to the Capitol tomorrow, day after tomorrow, to rally for public lands here in Montana.
Oh, awesome.
And my dear wife, she's such a sweetheart. Part of the reason I love her so much is that she's gentle. She doesn't want, conflict is not her deal. But as I explained to her, there's some things you just got to stand up for. And that's what I do.
Because there's an issue of influence. You might not have control, but you can have influence. Yeah, and you have to choose your spots, right?
You do. And I think it's the news cycle that makes most of us, that's so hard for us all to kind of
for sure
handle. It's crazy lately.
It is crazy. So on the note of resilience, like just to sort of wrap it around, because you've been so generous with your time and I so appreciate it.
No problem.
What's coming up for you? Like lessons to leave us with a lifetime of just incredible connection and storytelling and really deeply appreciating nature and species in nature as not separate, but part of us. Like, what do we learn? What can we learn? What's coming up?
Well, I guess it would be again, this gets back to hoping that we can convince people, humans on the planet, that the species that live around us are worth making some changes for, to make sure that we always have these things, because they're really cool. One of the things that always just floors me, anytime I spend time in situations where there are people that aren't wildlife photographers, but or let's say aren't professional nature people of some sort. I have never met one that has seen a polar bear or has seen a zebra giving birth or a cheetah, hunting a Thompson's gazelle. I've never seen one of them kind of go, let's go. No,
right. You just stay and watch.
When people have made that commitment to get out, and if you can convince them, hey guys, let's stay. We got to stay. We've been here for 20 minutes, but I'm telling you, this cheetah is on the verge of going hunting. Let's stay and watch it. And that has come from lots and lots of years of working with animals and trying to understand their the way they live and the way they operate. And when it happens, and people have accepted your your guidance that maybe we should stay a little longer, they're floored. I've never seen one of them go, well, that sucked. I mean, we could have been back having a beer at the lodge. No, they don't. They go, holy mackerel.
Yeah.
That was so incredible. I've never seen animals not impress people.
Yeah.
They always impress.
Yeah.
It's sometimes difficult to get people to slow down enough to connect up with the clocks that the animals are on. That's the most difficult thing. But if you can get people to connect with that clock and stop and watch for a while, the animals always impress.
100%.
And that is encouraging because if you can get enough people to get impressed by what they just saw, then you can get people to go, yeah, maybe we should back off on. Do we really need another golf course?
Right.
Well, we don't really need another golf course. Let's not tear this place down. Let's let the owls live and the elk come through and the bighorn sheep migrate. And that's what you hope that, and to be honest, that's what a lot of what my wife Tanya and I are doing today is taking people to the places I've worked all my life, taking pictures for a living. We now mostly teach. I call her Miss Logistics, and she puts the trips together. She tells me where we got to be.
So we're planning, my husband and I are working on trips for the next few years to places like, I don't know about places that are as cold as the places that you go, but I'm in. So we need to keep that conversation going and we need to share it in my newsletter and in book and the show notes, because this is we need to get in for long enough to watch the story open and take place. So thank you for doing that work, you and Tanya.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. It's been fun chatting with you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Last words of wisdom for us, or you've given us
I guess my last words of wisdom would be, don't give up on nature and do everything you can to bring it home. And like what I'm getting ready to do on Wednesday, to go to the state capitol in Helena, Montana, to support our public lands and our wildlands here in Montana. It's a big deal. We're very fortunate here in the West where we have a lot of public property, and that's not just good for us humans, but it's amazing for the animals because it's been set aside, protected, national parks, national refuges, national forests, all these things that help the animals have space to live. And, so give them, support them.
And
you'll never be disappointed.
You'll never be disappointed. Yeah. And to that end, be uncomfortable. It's okay. You don't have to hunker down and hide.
Yeah.
There are times for that.
Yeah.
But be uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to go be an advocate for most people.
That is true.
It is. You're putting yourself in a place of potential, whatever,
Well, it's
difficult
true.
stuff.
It's
but
true.
We need to be uncomfortable too. Or else we're not going to be able to do it better next time.
I was just looking at the weather. We're supposed to have a major snowstorm. I'm going to still go. I'm going to figure out how to get there. I've got a 4-wheel drive vehicle. I'm going to get there because it's so important. Yeah. But we all have to take these chances to stand up for the things we care about.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
so
my
beautiful.
pleasure.
Thank you so much, Dan. I cannot wait. And I'm there wherever. I don't know where you're going next. But I'm with you and Tanya, and I'm dragging my family along.
I'll send you a list. I'll send you an email. We'll exchange some.
Great, and we'll post it on the show notes so we can bring the whole Resilience Gone Wild community on a bunch of your trips. Thank you, Dan.
I appreciate it.
You're amazing. Thank you
so much, Jessica. It was nice meeting you, and thanks for all the work you're doing. It's great to get people interested in these critters.
Yeah, totally. Looking forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.
This has been a production of BLI Studios, produced by me, Kai. Follow along with our other BLI produced shows at balancinglifesissues.com/podcast-BLI. Got an idea for the show? Email me, Kai, at balancinglifesissues.com. And don't forget to stay in touch with your host, Jessica, at jessica@winwinwinmindset.com. Anything else to add, Miles?
Yeah.